Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We are so excited to have you all here and talk about this really interesting topic, and we have some awesome speakers. So this is part 2 of our Women's Health webinar series, and today we are going to be discussing cardiometabolic health in South Asians. So a very brief kind of overview about who we are. So as you might have seen when you signed up, this webinar is hosted by SAAPRI. SAAPRI stands for the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan action research organization. We were established in 2001 with the mission to create data-driven and human-centered research focused specifically on the South Asian American community and their concerns. Using our research, we advance public policy by proposing data-driven objectives and just generally kind of working on community outreach and really reaching out to our community. SAAPRI is also part of this greater coalition called the Asian Health Coalition, or the AHC. This is a network of organizations that's really committed to advancing health equity. As part of our work, as part of the AHC, we promote the All of Us research program, which helps gather important clinical data from South Asian Americans to better inform personalized care and just increase their representation in medical research generally. These are some links. If you're interested, you can check them out or kind of feel free to let us know if you weren't able to grab them. And before we get into the great information that we have, want to just provide a disclaimer that the information we're going to cover today is for general informational and educational purposes only. We're not providing any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We're just people kind of sharing our experience. And any views expressed by speakers, panelists, or anyone else are their own and don't necessarily reflect the views of SAAPRI. Oh, uh-oh. I don't know what happened. Okay, we're gonna advance one slide. All right, we'll go back to that one. So before we go into, I wanna take a minute to introduce our panelists. So for each of our panelists, if you could just take a few minutes to tell us about yourself, your background, and your experience with the topic. Whoever wants to go first. Oh no, am I frozen?
Nami, you want to go first?
I was going to let you go first, Alka, since you're the guest from San Francisco.
Oh, we're both so kind to each other. My name's Alka Kanaya, and I've been working with Namratha Kandula for at least the last, 15 years. And I'm a general internist, and I work at UC San Francisco. I see patients half day a week, and I spend most of my time doing research. And the research that we've been doing has been focused on South Asian health and looking at what factors drive the high rates of diabetes and heart disease in men and women of South Asian origin. It's great to be here.
And I'm Namratha Kandula. I go by Nami. I'm also a primary care physician like Dr. Kanaya and a researcher at Northwestern University here in Chicago. I've been a longtime supporter of SAAPRI, so always a pleasure to work with them on education and advocacy for our community. I also study the health of South Asian people in the United States, and we have led an effort in the Chicagoland area called the South Asian Health Lifestyle Initiative, really focused on empowering our community to understand what their health risks as well as protective factors are and how they can improve the health of themselves and their family through understanding the latest research and medical advice and science. So really happy to be here today and share what we've learned with you.
Right. Thank you for that awesome intro. My name is Prottusha Sarkar. I am the Health Equity Fellow at SAAPRI. I am a medical student at Northwestern, and I've been working with SAAPRI for the past couple of years, and we're really, really excited to bring you this Women's Health series and just really talk about some issues that become increasingly important as we learn more about South Asians in general. All right, so let's advance to the next slide. So starting off our discussion today, I think let's kind of talk about some typical patient scenarios that someone might see when it comes to cardiometabolic health. So I'm going to start on the left here. So on the left, we have a woman in her late 50s, peri or postmenopausal. Dr. Kanaya, I wanted to kind of ask you, what are some of the health status changes that women who are perimenopausal or postmenopausal might face?
Yeah, thank you. I think, I see a lot of peri and postmenopausal women and older women in my general medicine practice. So this is a very common scenario when in this part of life when women are starting to notice some changes happening in their body. They're, definitely, the periods are irregular or stopping completely. There's a lot going on during this time, both with changes in energy levels, with changes in sleep and in mood, sometimes changes in weight gain, and some women may experience hot flushes and other more, concerning symptoms around the menopause. And so this is a time where women tend to re-engage with their medical care. I think this is a really good opportunity to get a full checkup to really understand not only your current health, but also to help women set up their future health and how they age and aging more healthfully. That's really the goal, and to try to prevent any diseases, or if there are new concerns starting with health, to get on treatment, appropriate treatment early to prevent more complications in the future.
Right, yeah, thank you for kind of running through that. It's definitely a time of like a lot of change for a lot of women. And I think you're right about saying, it's a time to really re-engage with that health system and think about getting that full checkup if that's not something that's been like a priority until that point. So kind of moving on to another type of patient we might see. So we have, an example of a younger person, someone in their early 30s who maybe has had some trouble managing their weight, and desires, to have children in the future. So this one I want to ask to Dr. Kandula, what are some risks that you think patients should be aware of as, someone like this thinks about getting pregnant or fertility?
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting because I actually saw a patient very similar to this in clinic very recently, and often see young women like this. So a typical patient might come in and, they're, as you said, around 30 years old, really busy, for example, trying to finish up graduate school. They are also working part-time. They tell me that they have a family history where their dad had diabetes diagnosed around the age of 52, and their mom has struggled with their weight and has prediabetes and high blood pressure. And so this young woman was saying that she was just really concerned because over the last few years, she's noticed she's gained a significant amount of weight, and she's mostly eating on the run and just does not feel like she has time to do any kind of exercise or physical activity. And, it's a stressful time because she's juggling a lot of things, both with working and school. And so, wanted to understand, like, what would that mean for future fertility? And if she were to get pregnant, what are some things that she needed to think about? And, I think my first reaction was like, well, I'm so excited that you're actually thinking ahead and coming in to talk about this before it's happening. And there's a lot of opportunities that we can take because that foundation of health, of weight and the diet and the exercise, all of those things can set you up for a healthy pregnancy. We do know that uh, having excess weight before somebody gets pregnant can set them up for certain risks related to gestational diabetes or high blood pressure during pregnancy. And those can have effects on the mom's health as well as the child's health. And so this is a great time to start thinking about it and to work with your family and with your physician and others on the healthcare team to figure out how do you build that good foundation for future pregnancy.
Yeah, those are definitely kind of things to, I feel like I've seen that patient many times, and I'm just a student. So I can't imagine how many times, you've seen it as a primary care physician. So kind of expanding on some of our patient examples from earlier, I wanted to next really talk about the first question, like why is it even important to understand and talk about metabolic health in general? And either one of you, whoever wants to speak, can go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, one thing to think about that I want our audience to really think about is understanding metabolic health. I mean, we're giving you specific examples of someone who is like a younger person and somebody who's an older person. And the reason we're doing that is because this is something you want to think about across your whole life course. It really starts with being like gestational in utero and then being a young child and a teenager. And as you grow up, like how is your cardiometabolic health changing? So I think that's one thing, is just to think about this as a lifelong journey, and that there are certain inflection points like pregnancy, like menopause, sometimes the transition through puberty that lead to changes in your metabolic health. And so what we know when we talk about metabolic health, we think really about weight, about blood sugar, about cholesterol, about blood pressure. That's sort of the idea of metabolism and metabolic health. And we know that those things affect all aspects of health at different points in our lives. So for example, as we've said, it can affect pregnancy and fertility. It can affect how you age, and it can affect future things like cancer risk and heart disease risk. So it's important to take that life course approach, and that it's never too late to start building that foundation. But if we can really encourage it in younger people too, it's great, because it's a good way to stay healthy and as you age, stay as disease-free as possible and as active as possible. So it's really an important life course perspective on this. And we do have some evidence that I can turn over to Dr. Kanaya, that South Asian women are at higher risk for some of these metabolic conditions. And then that could affect them at these different points in their life in ways that could be more of a risk factor or more harmful to their health. So Alka, do you want to talk about maybe some more specifics?
Yeah, and I think I want to also just bring up one thing. And when we talk about cardiometabolic risk, it's just a big word, right? But I think to break it down, it's about your blood sugar, it's about your cholesterol levels, it's about your blood pressure, and it's about the weight and where you put the weight. And at least those first three things, the sugar, the cholesterol, and blood pressure, those are silent. Those are factors that we don't know about unless we get them, or we actually pay attention and get them measured. And so I think that they're not front of mind for most people, but in these times when people are planning a future pregnancy or starting to have changes in their body and are noticing things, or when they're finally, able to pay attention to themselves, I think we should, call this out as a very common phenomenon for women of most groups, is that we're often spending so much time caring for others in our life, right? And caring for our partners, our spouses, our kids, grandkids, our older adults, our parents. So we're often the caregivers, and there's very few times in life that we actually want to or are able to really focus on ourselves. And I think that this is really important because, like I said, those first three factors are silent. So you don't even know that that might be actually a problem that may be brewing in your body. And some women already kind of perceive that they may be at higher risk because they have a mom or a dad or a grandparent who's had heart disease or a stroke or had some other problems with their heart. And so they're already a little bit heightened in terms of their concern. And I think, knowing your own risk factors and being able to be proactive in measuring these risk factors and changing them with what you can do yourself, as well as working together with your primary care physician or your gynecologist, OBGYN. It's really important that you start, learning what they are, and making those changes earlier is better. We've learned from certain studies that have been done in, young adults all the way to the middle ages, that even having a slightly high blood pressure for, in your 20s and 30s actually translates into a lot more risk of heart disease and stroke as you age. And so getting your blood pressure in good control early in life has big payoffs later in life. And it's important to pay attention.
Yeah, I think your kind of point about the silence of a lot of these things is so important, because I'm in my mid-20s. I have so many South Asian friends that maybe don't struggle with their weight, but then they go to the doctor and their A1C is high. And that I wanted to ask, in your clinical experience, is that something you see often? And what kinds of is that something that you see, and what kinds of things would you tell a patient who kind of comes in with that to you? Obviously, this is not clinical advice, but just generally.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I want to also just emphasize is that it's not just about your weight, right? Like, we have actually learned that a lot of South Asian people may have a normal weight, but they still have these risk factors, and we can get into why that is later. I don't necessarily want to get into the weeds right now. So what I would say is, regardless of what your weight is, it's important to go in and get checked for, Prottusha, you said A1C, which is a hemoglobin A1C test, and that's specifically to look for abnormal blood sugar. So like prediabetes or diabetes or something like that, because the only way to know is to go get that checked. And same with blood pressure, same with cholesterol. So regardless of somebody's actual weight, for South Asians, it seems really important to go in and get those factors checked. And we do see that a lot. We are seeing that younger South Asian people do have higher levels of certain risk factors, as well as low levels of physical activity. And so I think, again, we need to come back to thinking about, are there things we can do that are within our daily lives, like our exercise, our diet, that could promote better metabolic health?
I also, wanted to ask, on the slide, we talk about reducing cancer risk. What kinds of cancers, would you be thinking about when you think about reducing cancer risk?
That's a good question, and it's quite controversial. I don't think there's a clear known connection between these cardiometabolic risk factors and cancer risk. We know that there's some evidence of a slightly higher risk of breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer in people who are more heavy with higher weight status. And some of that may be working through similar kind of diabetes and all of the other risk factors that go hand in hand with being overweight, but it's not a clear-cut connection. We know that diet may play a really important role in certain cancers, like colon cancer. Having a higher fiber diet is known to be a preventative of colon cancer risk. And so usually, diet and exercise and weight all kind of go hand in hand. And so the feeling is that the healthier you are at an early age, you just prevent all of these risk factors from stacking up, so that you end up preventing a lot of downstream later life events, including some cancers and diabetes and heart disease and even dementia. That's another long-term late life risk that seems to be also driven by these same, diet, lifestyle, and behaviors that we have control over.
Yeah, you mentioned dementia. I think that's something I think about when it comes to healthy aging. What other things, are we thinking when thinking about metabolic health, cardiovascular health, and aging? Like, are we talking mobility? Are we talking just like chronic diseases? Like, what are you kind of thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I think about is frailty, which means, an older person who maybe is more prone to falling or having balance issues or not being able to do the basic things that they want to be able to do, like walking or cooking, cleaning, those types of things. And so again, we know that those foundational factors of like maintaining a healthy body weight, making sure that you are preserving muscle mass, and we'll talk about that as, what happens to muscle as people age and what are some strategies to maintain it. So all of those things, I think, affect our brains, our bodies, every aspect of our lives. But for me, it's, healthy aging is like, can you still do the basic things that you want to do? And we see a lot of older South Asian people who have chronic diseases, but they're very well controlled and they're staying very physically active. And so they're not frail and they're able to do the things that they want. But then you also see the other side of that coin where people may have some chronic diseases and they are, the effects of medications and kind of having these conditions are making them less likely to be physically active. And then people can potentially get more frail and be at risk for falling and things like that. And then all of these factors, as Dr. Kanaya said, are associated with brain health. So your blood sugar, your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and in addition to that, things like your social relationships and how much stimulation you have, and also the social support in your life, all of these things are related to health across the life course. We haven't really brought up alcohol, but that might be just something to also mention. And I know people have a lot of questions about that, but that any amount of alcohol use does not seem to be associated with better health. And there is a relationship between increasing amounts of alcohol and certain cancers, as well as dementia risk. And so, again, because a lot of my patients ask me, like, is alcohol healthy or not healthy? And really, it's probably no amount is going to improve your health, and you want to have a minimal amount. So just another thing to think about.
Yeah, and a couple more things that we haven't talked about is cigarette or tobacco use, and that can be smokeless tobacco use, which there's a lot of different ways that South Asians consume tobacco, which is not all cigarette smoke. So gutka, pan, other ways that we, that South Asians can get nicotine and other chemicals that are part of chewing tobacco. And so that has also been, implicated in lots of cancer risk, head and neck cancer, lung cancer, and is a big risk factor for heart disease and stroke, and also for dementia. So that's another thing in our kind of locus of control where we can do something to make a change. And then sleep is another really important risk factor that, it sometimes is not completely in our control to have the best sleep, but something that there are many, many ways that you can work on improving the sleep quality and the sleep amount that you get. And so again, I think all these things kind of work together. They have really important combined effects: the diet, the exercise, the sleep, the avoiding tobacco, avoiding alcohol. They work together to, have, big effects on multiple different outcomes in life. And the one other thing we haven't really talked about is stress. And I mean, if you want to, you kind of touched on it with social networks.
Yeah, I think when I have conversations with my patients or with the work we're doing in the community, people always talk about how stress is affecting their health. And the example that I gave you of the young person who's juggling work and finishing up graduate school and helping out her family, you know, that all those things do lead to a fair amount of stressors that make it hard to take care of yourself. Like that's the most obvious thing at times, but just that persistent level of sort of feeling stressed probably leads to certain hormones in our body that are secreted and maybe activating more inflammation or other kinds of pathways in our bodies that are leading to increased metabolic risk. So we don't want to discount the importance of stress, which doesn't always feel like it's under our control. But it's still something to think about, you know, how do you manage it and how do you get the support that you need so that it's not negatively impacting you?
Yeah, that was the perfect transition into our next topic, which is kind of talking more specifically about risk factors for South Asian women. You already mentioned stress, and I know we talked about some of the things on the right, but kind of looking at this like little feedback loop we have on the left, can you tell me a little bit more about like family influence and how that might be a risk factor?
Yeah, and I think about family as a risk factor, but also a very protective factor. So all of these things, like I said, you know, there's two sides of the coin. Even something like stress is good. Like sometimes it's appropriate to be stressed out so that maybe you're going to study extra hard for an exam, but you know, it's a manageable amount of stress. You don't want it to be too much. But with regards to family, you know, we've done a lot of work with our South Asian community here in the Chicagoland area to try to understand how family might be influencing their health and their health behaviors. And one thing that we've heard from women is, you know, of course, there's the issue of like women taking care of other people and everyone else's needs before their own. But there are also some things related to as girls are growing up, they're not necessarily encouraged to do as much exercise or stay as involved in sports, especially, you know, once they kind of get into their teenage years, that they don't have as many opportunities for exercise as physical activity, and that their family may have other expectations for them. And again, I don't want to generalize. This isn't everybody. There's other cases where this is not true, but that is something that we've heard. So that for women, exercise just may not be a thing that's encouraged, or they don't see role models around them who are doing a lot of exercise. Another thing is just around some of these life stages. So like around the time of pregnancy, women being told like, oh, you know, it's not safe to exercise, or it doesn't matter how much weight you gain, like you should be eating as much as you can because it's healthy for you, it's healthy for the baby, and you should just rest and take it easy. And, you know, obviously your family wants to take care of you, but those things aren't necessarily going to be helpful. So just recognizing that there are some beliefs that families may have or the ways that they interact with each other that could create some risk for women's health. But then there's also really protective things that we've learned. For example, just the support that you get from your family, like emotional support is important, but also that for older South Asian people, they said their children really motivate them a lot to do exercise and to eat healthy. And they talk about their kids coming over to their house and going for walks with them or sharing information on their Fitbit and saying like, how many steps did you do today? So a lot of children in South Asian families, like adult children, are actually role models for their older parents. And the older parents really look to them for advice and support in terms of healthy behaviors. So I think, again, family can operate as in different ways, but thinking about how can you get the support of your family and how can you share with them, well, this is what I need to do to take care of myself. I need your support. And thinking about exercising with someone in your family or a buddy that's going to hold you accountable. So those are things that can be very helpful and that we have found are helpful. Specifically for a lot of South Asian women, their partner, their spouse, seems to be really important in terms of motivating them to exercise and to eat healthy. And so asking for that support is important. And hopefully, you are able to get the support that you need.
Yeah, I think family is like a really big part of like South Asian culture generally, and I'm sure you've seen maybe patients come in with family members when they come to see you in clinic, and I think it's great to kind of address that as like a really both risk but potential, but also protective factor, when it comes to our health. I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about biology or just kind of any other elements you think might be related to biology in terms of risk factors for South Asian women.
I can start that off. A recent study just came out of India a couple months ago where they surveyed adolescent girls living across India. All states of India, I think, were sampled. And what they found was that the prevalence of something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCO, was quite high actually in Indian women, or adolescent girls and women. It was in the order of like 25 to almost 30%. It varied a little bit state by state. And that is quite high. It's actually much higher than in most other countries. And so, it's a syndrome that is an imbalance of the female estrogen hormone and the male testosterone or other androgen hormones. And it is something that is genetic. It's inherited. It runs in families. And it can be a risk factor outside of all the risk factors we've talked about that can lead to diabetes and heart disease. Having kind of this imbalance in the hormone levels can be a risk factor for infertility, for having trouble getting pregnant, and then for diabetes, as well as for fatty liver and for heart disease. And so we know that there may be more of this in Indian or South Asian women than in other groups of women. We've also seen that there's a lot higher prevalence of type 2 diabetes and gestational diabetes in women and in men from South Asia. And when people have looked at genetic, risk factors, there hasn't been like a smoking gun. There hasn't been one, gene or one mutation that seems to be, very highly risky for South Asians. But when you put together many, many, many different small mutations, there may be somewhat higher risk in South Asians compared to other groups that make us a little bit more prone to developing diabetes as well as heart disease.
Yeah, and I think, as we said, there's a lot of things on here, but it's helpful to get a little bit deeper into some of them and what might be unique about people of South Asian background. And thinking about biology and weight, one of the things that we've learned is that South Asian people, despite having a normal weight, have a lot of fat in their organs. So fat in their liver, in the heart, and less muscle mass. And that is something, of course, that may be biological, but it could also be environmental and behavioral over time. But it seems to start at a pretty young age, where South Asian people do have this different type of of body composition. And that body composition, having more fat in the organs, like liver fat or fat in the heart, as well as less lean muscle mass, those things seem to be associated with more cardiovascular risk factors. So those things are a risk factor for abnormal blood sugar, cholesterol, or high blood pressure. And so that could be one of the, sort of more biological or body composition factors. And we don't know if that's genetic or if it's, again, environmental, if it's related to diet, but we do sort of see it starting at a younger age and kind of tracking throughout life. that different type of body composition. So that's why I was saying, like, it's important to get checked for risk factors, even if your weight is normal. And it's important to keep exercising, even if your weight is normal. Another thing we've heard is, like, you don't need to exercise unless you're trying to lose weight. And that's not true. Exercise is for everybody, regardless of your weight status, because it helps with overall body composition and maintaining muscle mass.
Yeah, thank you for, I think, pointing out that last part. Because I just hear that so often, that exercise, it doesn't matter if I'm not trying to lose weight, but it really is important for everything. And it's on the right side too. So maybe we can talk about life's essential 8 and some behavioral risk factors. You already mentioned a couple of them, like sleep, and nicotine exposure, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the other things. And what is life's essential 8 in the first place?
Sure. So yeah, this was it's a clever way of kind of putting both risk factors and behaviors together in thinking about what causes people to develop heart disease and stroke. And so this is something the American Heart Association, and happy Heart Month to everybody. Dr. Kandula's background shows that it is Heart Month. February is officially Heart Month, and so I'm glad we're doing this right now. But these are the 8 major risk factors that the American Heart Association wants us to know about, so that we are proactive in getting them checked and to improve each one, because these are all risk factors that we can improve, many by our behaviors, but some with medications and working together with your physician. So sleep, I can start with a couple, and then maybe we can go back and forth. So sleep, it seems like it's both the quantity and the quality of sleep. And the number you want to aim for is 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And it's, that may be something hard to get in one stretch, but it's about the 7 hours. It seems to be the inflection where people have less risk in the future of developing many different chronic diseases. So 7 to 8 hours, and now with the wearables that you can purchase, you can monitor your sleep. So it tells you not only how long you've slept for, but how good the quality of sleep. So you try to get good quality sleep for at least 7 hours a day.
Yeah, and thinking about diet, I think that's really interesting, because everybody always asks, like, what should I eat? Or they're also like, well, I already know what to eat, but I'm having a hard time eating the things I'm supposed to eat. And one of the things that Dr. Kanaya and I have been working on is, in this large study of people of South Asian background, is trying to understand the dietary patterns of the South Asian community, because, many South Asian people are immigrants, and so they grew up eating a very different diet back home than what they're eating in the US. And then, of course, with time and living here, that people's diets are going to change, and you may incorporate more Western foods, or like the American diet, or you may retain a traditional South Asian diet or aspects of it. But, again, what we've learned is that even within the South Asian diet, there are different types of South Asian diets that are healthy and more healthy and less healthy. So the South Asian diet can consist of a lot of kind of high fat fried foods or high fat dairy, and low in fresh fruits and vegetables. And if people are eating a South Asian diet, but it's high in refined carbohydrates and fat and sweets and things like that, then that leads to more abnormalities in blood sugar and in the amount of fat we have, again, around our organs, and cholesterol abnormalities and things like that. So we've also found that people who are eating South Asian foods, but they incorporate a lot of legumes and lentils and fresh fruits and vegetables and low-fat dairy, those individuals, like, they're still eating South Asian food, but they have fewer risk factors for heart disease. So their blood pressure is better, their cholesterol is better, their blood sugar is better. So even if you're eating a South Asian diet, like I don't want people to think like, oh, that's unhealthy or something like that, because that's another myth, like, oh, South Asians just have unhealthy diets. That's not necessarily true. It's really like, what's the quality of the food that you're consuming? And have you been able to cut down on a lot of like the refined carbohydrates and high fat foods? In addition, if you're eating more westernized foods, the same principles remain. So again, it's those fresh fruits and vegetables, it's the whole grains, it's the lean protein, nuts. So those are all things that are the foundation to any healthful diet, regardless of whether it's westernized or South Asian or things like that. And I think one fun thing to do within our community is just to exchange healthy recipes and how you can prepare traditional South Asian foods in healthy ways and add things that you may not have thought of before. So those are some of the things that we've learned about the types of dietary patterns that are associated with better cardiovascular health. And then physical activity, of course, is something which I think we all struggle with. It's hard to make time for it. It always seems like the last priority. One thing that we've been learning is, any movement is good. But one thing that is helpful is some brisk movement, right? So walking, if you're going to do walking, which is great, it's good to walk as briskly as you can so that your heart rate gets up and you're breathing a little more heavily and things like that. And so brisk walking is very healthy. Yoga is something that Dr. Kanaya can talk about a little bit more because she's done some studies related to that can be very good for people's health depending on the type of yoga. And then one thing that we are learning more about is muscle strengthening exercises. And I specifically said that South Asians seem to have less lean muscle mass. And so it's really important to build the muscle mass and to do something with resistance exercises. So that could be using your own body weight or using weights. And doing that so that we're not just taking care of our heart with kind of the aerobic exercise, but we're also taking care of our muscles and our bones and keeping them strong with resistance exercise and weights.
Great. And we've talked about blood sugar, but diabetes is a really big problem for many, many South Asians and families, and that is something that is preventable. But the earlier you start in life to try to prevent it, the better. So, exercise, diet, all of these things seem to influence blood sugar levels, glucose levels. Having a diet that is more rich in legumes and whole grains can bring down blood sugar levels because of the fiber in the diet. So there are many medications that are available now that are well tolerated and can be really, really helpful in controlling blood glucose. So once someone has a diagnosis of diabetes, really need to work together with your primary care doctor to get that blood sugar level, your hemoglobin A1C, as low as possible, ideally under 6.5%. The younger you are, it matters more to get that glucose down into the normal range. In people who are much older in life, in their 70s and 80s, it doesn't have to be as strict as in the younger people. Again, long-term studies have found that the earlier in life that you control risk factors, it pays dividends later in life. So people who are out of control with blood pressure or glucose or cholesterol early in life tend to have a lot more problems stack up. And we can touch a little bit more on weight. As Dr. Kandula said, it's not all about the number on the scale, because we know that even with a normal body weight, that South Asians tend to have fat in the wrong places in terms of where we put fat, which may be determined by some genetic factors that is not really in your control. So what can you do about that? And that is trying to stay as in a healthy weight as much as possible, but having the ability to do exercise and eat right does matter. There's been studies where they've looked at people who eat a diet that's high in saturated fat, and that could be from animal fat like red meat, but it can also be from butter or ghee or other high-fat foods. And what can happen is with that additional saturated fat, people have found that going on a low saturated fat diet can improve the fat that's in the liver, and that's around the abdominal organs. And that's really important. That is something that, you know, we have in our control to be able to work on.
I also wanted to ask, you know, you earlier, and sorry, my camera isn't working, so I'm just gonna turn my video off. You had mentioned earlier about nicotine exposure and some very specific kind of things for South Asians. I was wondering if you could expand on that and also maybe talk about, you know, vaping or e-cigarettes, you know, things that are popular among the younger population.
Yeah, so in general, the use of tobacco seems to be low in people who are immigrants from India specifically, but is higher in people that might be from Bangladesh or Pakistan. So there are differences depending on what South Asian country you come from. So that's something to just remember. But also for women, you know, second generation women who are born in the United States and grow up here, they do have a higher rate of smoking and the use of nicotine and like vaping than their parents' generation. So that is something that happens, and just to be aware of, to have those conversations within families, and not necessarily in a judgmental way, but just like you would about a health factor. Like this is like any other health issue of trying to avoid nicotine exposure. And I mean, we think vaping is not good for people's lungs. And there are large studies that are looking at that right now as trying to understand the effects of vaping on people's lungs. So, you know, you want to work with your physician or health professional to figure out, if you are using tobacco products, what are ways to cut down and then eventually completely quit using tobacco? Because there's a lot of, again, helpful behavioral therapies as well as medications that can help people stop vaping, stop using tobacco, whether it's chewing tobacco or cigarettes, and things like that. And, you know, there's a lot of marketing towards young people around this. Even though the prevalence of smoking is low, the prevalence of vaping is still a significant health concern.
Yeah, thank you for kind of clarifying that point, because I think that's something that as vaping has become more popular, it's just not something I've seen a lot of people maybe talk about in, you know, in terms of risk factors. So I wanted to now transition into some protective factors, which both of you already mentioned some of these, but you know, being South Asian comes with many good things in addition to some of the more negative risk factors we talked about earlier. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, you know, some of these things that are listed on the slide, or some of the things that you feel like help South Asians either combat diseases in the cardiometabolic space, or just, you know, help improve their cardiometabolic health generally.
Yeah, so we have actually looked at kind of people's social networks, which means your family, your friends, the people you socialize with, and how that affects their health. And it's really interesting because people of South Asian background, and this is really mostly first generation people so people who weren't born in the United States, actually have pretty large social networks. So they describe having a fair number of friends and family members that they feel close to. So, you know, we ask questions like, how many people do you feel close to, or do you talk to on a regular basis, and things like that. And compared to what we know about the average American kind of population in surveys, South Asians seem to have big social networks, mostly comprised of their family, but also close friends. And that the size of the social network is actually associated with better cardiovascular health. And I think that's really interesting, as well as some of the behaviors of your social network. So like if you have a spouse that exercises or that exercises with you, you're more likely to be doing exercise. So there's lots of protective ways that your social network might be promoting good health. You know, another thing is we know that family members can help with like taking medications or driving you to a doctor's appointment, or helping you, understand what the doctor just said. So there's many different things that a social network or your family and friends, just to use the lay terms, can do. So it's important to spend time cultivating those relationships and not just living in the digital world or spending all our time on our phones or computers, but that actually investing in healthy relationships, whether it's family or friends, can really have positive effects on our overall health.
That's particularly true with aging. And as people grow older and they have, people in their lives are moving away or are passing, that, to stay kind of as close as you can to people in the social network and not feel alone and isolated. I think that's really important. I want to touch a little bit on what we've learned about spirituality in our study. So Dr. Kandula and I have been running the MASALA study for the last 15 years, and we did a whole series of surveys that focused on religion and spirituality in the South Asians in the MASALA cohort. And what we found is that many South Asians have, strong religious affiliations, and the people who felt like they were more spiritual actually had lower levels of anxiety and lower levels of depression. And they felt like they had stronger ways of coping when things happened around them. And so I think that this is a really important resilience factor for many of us when we go through, times of grief or times of trouble, to be able to have things that can help make us feel supported. And so spirituality seems to be a very important factor, regardless of the religion that someone practices. It's just that having that. In terms of yoga, we did a randomized controlled trial. So a study where we took people with pre-diabetes. They weren't all South Asian, but there were South Asians in the study. People of all different backgrounds were in the study. And we randomized them to either doing a yoga intervention or doing stretching, seated active stretching. And both of these interventions were done in classes with different, people all being part of the groups. And we did it for a year. And what we found is that the people in the yoga group who were doing mostly a restorative form of yoga, so it's not a lot of exercise-based yoga, so it's more like a relaxation yoga with supported poses, with eyes closed, more relaxing for the body, that brings your heart rate down, brings your respiratory rate down, that those people actually improve their blood glucose levels. At the end of 1 year, their blood glucose levels went from a pre-diabetes level, and it went down by 6 milligrams per deciliter. And the people in the stretch group, who also got the same number of classes together but weren't doing yoga, they were doing stretching, they didn't have much change in their glucose over a year. So yoga, which is comes from South Asian roots, is a type of activity that people may enjoy and may like to do in groups, and it has benefits. It has clear benefits, at least in the study that we did, that can be helpful. I mean, it's not going to improve your muscle strength or give you cardiovascular health, but it's another tool in our box of strategies that we can think about as doing something healthy for our health.
Yeah, and I like that phrase, Alka, the toolbox, because these are all part of a pretty large toolbox. Like none of these things, again, is like the magic solution to making sure we stay healthy, but these are some of the pieces to the puzzle that we know are really important. And again, back to this concept of the diet, which is a very important one and is, again, really foundational to our health, because what we put in our bodies is, of course, going to affect everything. There is some research on some of the grains that were used in traditional South Asian cooking, kind of before the green kind of revolution that happened agriculturally in India and South Asia in the 1950s and 1960s, where traditionally people were using millet and other whole grains in their cooking, but then when white rice production became the main kind of staple for people, because it would feed a lot of people and it had a long shelf life, that was the move over to more refined carbohydrates. And so one of the things that people are really been interested in and talking about more is like, can we replace some of that white rice and those refined flours and refined carbohydrates, whether it's like refined wheat and chapatis or whatever it might be, with some of these more traditional grains that were used in South Asian cooking. And so in one of our studies, the Saheli study, we actually go through all the different grains that you could find in a South Asian grocery store, because there are so many different types that are whole grains, and how you could incorporate them into your chapatis or eat them with curries or mix them with different legumes and lentils to make very tasty South Asian foods. And so there are lots of things in the South Asian diet that are healthy. The dals, the lentils, the vegetables, as long as they're not over fried and overcooked. These are all really important things to continue eating. And people always ask about like ghee and oils and all of that. And I think the main take-home message for us is like, you want to limit those things, right? Like you don't want to be overusing any oil or any ghee or any type of fat. You want to limit those and really focus on the things we do know that are healthy, which again are the whole grains, the lentils, the fruits and vegetables. Yeah, so happy to answer more questions about that again, but I think it's important to stick with the big picture with diet and figure out what's going to work for you and what you can stick with and eat on a daily basis, because a lot of the fad diets and the fad ingredients, it's really hard to maintain that in the long term.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, women specifically, I think with regards to social networks or spirituality, if you know anything about, or you've, maybe seen patients or just other people, South Asian women who've really used their social networks or their spirituality to kind of help them manage conditions or things like that. Because, I've read a lot of research and all of it seems to say that a lot of women have really robust social networks, especially, and maybe sometimes are more spiritual than men. So
yeah, and our research does show that there is a lot more, many more women say that they have strong spiritual and religious beliefs and activities that they do than men. I mean, I think there are many ways that someone can, be spiritual, and religion is one of the ways, and, reading spiritual scripture, religious scriptures, or being involved in group activities, either at the temple or mosque or church. But also, there's ways that people, may define their own spirituality based on nature and being in a practice where it's individual practice and meditation practice, or it could be using, some spiritual, a little bit of both. And I know from experience, both, personally, as well as in family, as well as from patients, that many people have found a lot of relief when they're going through troubling times with having, loss of something in their life, or a troubling new diagnosis of cancer or heart disease or stroke, when they can focus in on their spirituality. And sometimes that means, could be meditation or these other ways that people find that it's quite supportive to them. It brings them some peace of mind. And so I do think that is a really important factor. And of course, it doesn't work for everybody. And we're not in any way saying that you must do this. It's just, it has been very, very helpful for many people.
okay, and then kind of transitioning into our last topic, which we've already discussed a lot of things, and there's been a lot of great advice shared throughout this webinar, but with limited time and resources, like the normal people kind of have, what do you think are maybe the most important or maybe the most like easiest ways that the average person could do to kind of mitigate their risk for cardiometabolic conditions?
Well, I guess for me, I was going to go back and think about that patient that I discussed, who's the young woman who's around 30 years old and is interested in potentially a pregnancy in a year or so, but is concerned because of weight management and her strong family history of diabetes. And for a patient like that, or a person in that life stage, I would definitely be concerned about their risk for gestational diabetes or high blood pressure during pregnancy. And so my goal for them as their physician would really be to try to prevent those things and help them enter pregnancy in as healthy of a state as possible. And so I'd really want to work with them to understand, what are their goals for themselves, and if weight management and improving their health to prepare for pregnancy was a priority, I think we would really work together on how to incorporate more physical activity and healthful dietary changes that would promote some more weight loss, or at least stabilize their weight as they were preparing to get pregnant. And of course, I would also have them check their blood pressure when they were visiting me in clinic and screen them for diabetes and make sure that those things were within normal limits. And, really just have them maybe talk with somebody who could provide more dietary counseling and thinking about what kinds of foods would work for them, or how could they eat a more healthy diet, even though they have this very busy lifestyle. So again, it would be going back to kind of what can they do to incorporate these healthy behaviors into their daily lives, considering everything else that's going on. Another thing about that I might ask this person is, is there somebody that you could exercise with that would motivate you? Who would be that person? And can you come up with a plan with them so that you can get more physical activity? And where do you want to start? And for some people, they have that person that maybe they could think of, but for other people, maybe they want to do it on their own, maybe join a class at the gym. It can be just walking outside, but whatever it is, again, it's sort of that partnership and really helping people think about what is it that's motivating you, and what are the small things that you can do to start building healthy habits and then getting more confident and continue building upon that.
And I think what you said is completely true at any age in life, even for the older woman who's, going through menopause or changes. I think that's really all it's about. It's about, we can talk about all of the risk factors and all the behaviors that are important for us to think about. But where are you in terms of your journey and your ability to change and incorporate things? What do you think you can work on first? What do you want to tackle? Is it physical activity? Is it sleep? Is it diet? Is it smoking? Which ones do you want to work on? Prioritize one. Let's start making changes. And for me, it's about making a commitment to doing that one thing that I'm going to commit to change. And what's worked for myself is scheduling it in so that I know that I'm going to be going to that weight class at least 2 days a week, and it's on my calendar. I get up and I go, because I know otherwise if I don't do it in the morning, I'm never going to do it. So these are strategies that have worked for me and have worked for many of my patients. And I think it's figuring out where you want to start and doing one change, keeping that going, and then tackling the second thing that you want to do. And I think taking it all on at one time is overwhelming. And then if you weren't able to succeed, it's disheartening and people give up, like, this is crazy, I can't do it all. Just start with one thing. And I agree with you that having a supportive partner, whether it's someone you live with or someone in your family or a friend, is super helpful, because you motivate each other, you bring each other up. If someone's not feeling up to it, you kind of help in that phase. So work on one thing and commit to it and do it, and then say, okay, I'm ready to take on the second thing. But know your risk factors. And I think that for South Asian women, I really recommend that, you know, there's a time in life where after you are done with your early, you know, pediatrics, when you're getting vaccines and going in on a more regular basis to see your pediatrician, girls and young women basically just fall out of medical attention, out of care until they're thinking about pregnancy or when they get pregnant, then they come back into care. But those years are really important because, again, you can start making those changes to have a healthier and easier time with pregnancy. And then women, again, fall out of care when they are busy with work and school and family and child, you know, raising children and caregiving. And then they come back into care when things get a little bit more freed up for them for caregiving, or when they're starting to have symptoms around menopause. And I'd say the more you can kind of work in, at least going to your primary care physician every 3 to 4 years throughout your life. And I'm not saying every year, 3 to 4 years, which should be really, really doable for most people. That is a nice way to at least touch base, recheck all the risk factors, and then that might be a motivating step for you to start making some changes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes I hear from people like, oh, I was so afraid to come here because I'm afraid you're going to give me bad news. And, you know, just trying to overcome that fear. Like, I understand that it can be scary to confront like our health and have to start thinking about like aging or what if my blood sugar is high. But I think the message we want to leave you with is like, that information, while it can seem scary, it can also be the thing that motivates you to finally make those changes. So, you know, don't let fear of going to the doctor or fear of getting bad news be the thing that stops you, because we know a lot about how to help people with these conditions and how people can stay healthy. And I really want to encourage everybody to approach this with courage and to not be afraid.
Those are some really kind of wise words, I think, to kind of wrap up our discussion. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that to me. You know, I don't want to get bad news. I don't want to go to the doctor. But yeah, you're right. You know, it's important to remember that information is empowering, and there's so many ways that we can help you. And sorry, your physician can help you, or whoever your practitioner is. I wanted to leave some time for some questions from the audience. We also, you know, have some that were sent in the chat, but if anyone in the audience wants to kind of unmute and ask a question, feel free to go ahead or send it in the chat if you don't want to do that. We do have one question that was sent earlier from a attendee. It was a question that says, in my previous prevention clinic, I have seen many South Asian women with lower HDL, LDL, and high HDL. Can you maybe allude to why you might be seeing that? And additionally, what are your thoughts about the newer BMI cutoffs for South Asians?
Dr. Kanaya, do you want to take that?
So the first part was a low HDL, and was the question, is that common in South Asians?
It was a low LDL and a high HDL, and can you allude to why South Asian women like might be having that on their lab work?
So a pattern that is very common in South Asian women and men is more of a low HDL and a somewhat medium to slightly high LDL. And when we say these, it's just the type of cholesterol. And HDL used to be called the healthy cholesterol, that the higher the number, the better. We don't think it's that healthy anymore. So having a low HDL may not be the best for you, but certainly we don't need to have a very high HDL either. The LDL, it seems to be the one that is more important in terms of who develops plaque in the arteries. So, and that is something that we can actually work on with diet, exercise, as well as medications to bring down LDL levels. And then the second part of your question was, oh boy, I'm blank. I'm blacking out. What was the second part?
It's all good.
The BMI cut points.
Oh, the Asian BMI cut points. Yeah. Well, we, again, our research has found that BMI is not a very accurate predictor of who is at high risk of developing diabetes or heart disease. And so even if we try to use lower cut points for South Asians, it's not very accurate. So I think, one thing for us and our research has shown us is that because South Asians have more propensity to put fat in the organs like the liver and around the stomach and other organs in the intestines, that there isn't a perfect weight that we need to be aiming for. So I tend not to focus in on the BMI so much anymore. I think it's about being very healthy with enough muscle mass and getting good exercise and being as healthy as you can at whatever weight you are. And so not really focusing on a number. And that is the most recent recommendation, is actually that the numbers that we use are not very clinically meaningful.
We have another question from Noor. Could you comment on insulin resistance and prediabetes/PCOS? How can we navigate these concerns as younger Asian women?
Well, if you have concerns about PCOS, that's something to definitely see a physician, health professional about, because there are certain tests and criteria to help determine if you do actually have that syndrome. And if you do, there are different ways of treating that. So if that's a concern, I think seeing your physician is an important first step. With regards to this idea of sort of just insulin resistance in general, yeah, it does seem like South Asians are more insulin resistant than people of other backgrounds. And in addition to that, some of the data that we have show that not only do South Asians have insulin resistance, but they also have beta cell failure, which are cells in the pancreas that make insulin. So they're actually making less insulin. And in addition, over time, as they age, in addition to sort of not being able to use the insulin that they do make as effectively. And so the things that we know that are helpful for that are, again, insulin resistance is, if you build up muscle mass, muscles use glucose, they increase insulin sensitivity. So doing those weight-bearing exercises that we've been talking about and the weightlifting, probably really important to build up muscle mass. There are probably some dietary factors of trying to eat, less refined carbohydrates and things like that, that could be helpful. But again, we don't really know, to what extent diet modification can help with insulin resistance. So I would really, again, try to focus on the physical activity with regards to that. But there is a biological component that we may not be able to avoid or change.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for your question. I was just going to say that that's a really great transition into the next question we have in the chat, which is about genetics. So just reading the question off, it says, how do genetics influence the health risks for South Asian women, especially when they have a strong family history of things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, which are more prevalent in South Asian populations? And I know we kind of discussed this a little bit, but if there's anything else that you wanted to add, I think people would love to hear it.
Yeah, so I do think that there are biological and genetic reasons why South Asians are a little bit more prone to diabetes, prone to heart disease, and prone to putting fat in the wrong places. And there's also certain types of cholesterol that we can be a little bit more genetically prone to having high levels of lipoprotein little a. So there are some biological and genetic differences between South Asians and other groups. how much, if I had to say, like, if there's a whole pie, how much of that pie is genetic and how much of the pie is everything else we've been talking about, those life's essential 8 factors? I'd say maybe about 15% of that pie is genetic. And 85% or maybe 90% is not genetic. And it's things that we can control. It's things that we can do to change the risk that our genes may be giving us. And if we know that we come from a family history that is high risk because someone had a heart attack before the age of 50, someone had a stroke early in life, we've all heard of South Asians having earlier and more aggressive heart disease. If that runs in our family, then you've got a high genetic risk. You don't need to do any fancy genetic testing, And so that's that person who says, okay, well, it's only 10 to 15% of my risk, but because you have that risk, all the other, risk factors, you need to optimize and you need to be a little bit more, cautious because you don't want to have things kind of go a little bit out of control with glucose or blood pressure, because then that risk is really going to, tilt towards having early disease. So I would say in someone having a strong family history is all the more reason for you to know your risk factors and start working on them early.
Thank you for kind of going over that and talking about the importance of risk factors. Yeah, I wanted to ask because there were several times in this webinar you mentioned your research that you've done with South Asians, the SAAPRI study, the MASALA study, I think I heard. I wanted to ask, we know that having representation of a bunch of different types of people in research is important. I wanted to hear a little bit more about your experience doing research with the South Asian community and what that was like.
Well, I would say, I mean, it's very joyful, right? Because this is the work that we want to do and get to do. And so, we're really proud of the fact that our research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health and that it has really increased the inclusion and representation of South Asians in clinical research studies. And we've learned a lot about the health status of South Asians and how to improve the health of South Asians. And so one of the goals of the work we did through the SAAPRI project and with many of our community partners, including SAAPRI, is to really educate the South Asian community about what is research and why is it important to participate. And so I really would encourage the women on this call to find out more about different research studies that they could potentially be participating in, and encouraging family members to participate as well. One of the things we found in the MASALA study is that women were initially less likely to participate. Like we were getting a lot of male participants, but not enough female participants. And it was really interesting because in most other studies, you don't see that. You see more women participating. And when we were asking people, like, why aren't we getting more South Asian women into the MASALA study? We would hear things like, I don't have time, I don't feel comfortable driving that far, or I'm not really at risk, it's my husband that's more at risk. And so it was interesting because it was lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons is like South Asian women did not think they were at risk for heart disease or diabetes, so why do I need to participate in the study? And so it's important, again, for women to recognize that they are at risk and that by participating in research, you can learn something about your own health, but most importantly, contribute to health knowledge and the health of our community and future generations.
Thank you for going through that. I think I saw a couple of other questions. So we have one about, so many South Asian families sometimes rely on home remedies before seeking medical intervention. Wanted to hear, what role do you think that traditional knowledge could play in preventing or mitigating risk for cardiometabolic conditions, and where do you think we need some more scientific evidence?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in a lot of ancient traditions. There's a lot that we don't know, in terms of, Western medicine and science. So I don't discount things that people bring up, like my family believes very strongly that having bitter melon, Karela, to eat is really good for people with diabetes. And yeah, it does turn out that actually when they did a study in India and they looked at the properties of bitter melon, they found that it actually does bring down glucose levels. Same with jackfruit. There's so many things that, that there's ancient wisdom that from our communities that say that this is very helpful, and we know that there's antioxidant qualities to many of the spices that we use, like turmeric, and ginger, and there's many things that we don't know. So I always have like kind of healthy curiosity, and I think it'd be great if we actually got more scientific studies to test these with a placebo to really say, yeah, what are the effects and what are the downsides? Are there any downsides? And we should really study it before we go out and really propose that this is something that everyone should do.
Yeah, and I find it always helpful if patients are willing to share with me, like, what are those other things that they're doing and what do they think is helpful in their diet, so that we can work together. Because sometimes it's not like you may not use it to replace medication, but it's safe to take with your medication, and maybe there is an added benefit on top of it. Turmeric is something that has a lot of attention, right? And we use that in traditional South Asian cooking. So that's why, again, we were saying aspects of the traditional South Asian diet probably are very healthful, but we don't really understand as much as we should about that because we don't have good, strongly designed research studies. But definitely, I think it's good to work with patients to understand how they might be using home remedies. But not at the expense of like medication. If medication is also important, it's important to try to take your medication and not replace it with a home remedy, especially if your physician thinks you need the medication.
I wanted to call on Asim. I think you had raised your hand. Please unmute and feel free to ask your question.
Thank you, Prottusha. Hi, Dr. Kandula. Hi, Dr. Kanaya. Thank you so much for this informative session. This was really useful. I am Asim Tiwari. I am a family medicine resident from India. I've done my MPH at UIC, working as a research coordinator here at UIC Oncology Department. I really liked the points when you discussed about the South Asian demographic that is here in the Chicagoland area. I wanted to ask you if there are any specific programs that we have focused on the population in Naperville. I'm sure you're familiar with this area, that it has a huge growing population, South Asian population now, and then everyone is in my kind of age group, they're mid-30s, and then they're mostly from, I would say, a background that is not health or medical related. So I feel there's a huge unmet need coming from people who ask me questions, who are around me in friend circles. So do you think we can do something about it? And are there any programs that are running that I can tell people about? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. And I think you're right. There is a huge unmet need for programs that are meeting the needs of the South Asian community. And we had the Saheli research study, but that is finished now, which was trying to educate people about healthy diet, physical activity, and stress management, and help change their behaviors. And what that study showed is that we didn't actually change cardiovascular risk factors, but that there were small, modest improvements in people's physical activity and diet. And so I think that tells us that change is possible, but we still have to kind of understand what will really motivate the community. We do have a lot of resources available on the MASALA Study website. in terms of like the research we've done and the findings that we found. And, I think it's great if you share that with family and friends and people start going to the website and educating themselves and empowering themselves with that information. But I'm not aware of any specific programs right now in Naperville that are doing this on a large level. Like sometimes there's talks that are happening at temples or mosques, and we try to do some of those things. But yeah, I think it's like we need to keep passing the message and having more and more people sharing this message. That's not just Dr. Kanaya and me.
Thank you.
Hey, does anyone from the audience have any other questions? I know we're just about time.
I want to put in a plug for a docu-series that is going to be launched sometime this spring, and we can give you information about that. It's called The Brown Heart, and it's been put together over the last year by two physicians, Nirmal and Renu Joshi from Pennsylvania, and it's really about this. It's about heart disease in South Asians and why there's so much of it. And it's all about these risk factors we've been talking about. And they're going to be launching it on YouTube. And in India, it's going to be on Geo Disney TV. And so once it's out, we'd love your help at SAAPRI and other people to share it with social networks, because they're gonna do it as a 4-part series, but also as a 1-part, like just a movie. But it's all about this, and it's done in a really nice way where they're interviewing people from the US, from India, from Pakistan, from UK, and real stories about people who've had heart disease in early age groups, and what to do about it and how you can change your risk factors. And I think it's going to be a nice, very accessible way of getting it out to people like in their 30s, people who are busy and don't have time to engage in a formal program per se, but at least raising awareness. It's called The Brown Heart, and once it's out, we'll definitely share the information with you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's actually really interesting. I'll look forward to see it coming out. And as we hit time, thank you both for speaking today. I learned so much from this webinar, and I'm sure our audience members did too. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your time, all the prep, and everything that you shared with us.